At GitLab, we've spent a lot of time coming up with our company values and even more time iterating on them and helping to reinforce them. In the next lesson, we'll talk about how we put these into action, but first, here's what we try to live by. Helping others is a priority, even when it's not immediately related to the goals that you are trying to achieve. Similarly, you can rely on others for help and advice. In fact, you're expected to do so. Anyone can chime in on any subject, including people who don't work at GitLab. We do what we promise to each other, to customers, to users, to investors. We care about what you achieve, the code you shipped, the user you made happy, and the team member you helped. We give people agency to focus on what they think is most beneficial. We care about working on the right things, not doing more than needed, and not duplicating work. This enables us to achieve more progress, which makes our work more fulfilling. Diversity, inclusion, and belonging are fundamental to the success of GitLab. We aim to make a significant impact in our efforts to foster an environment where everyone can thrive. We do the smallest thing possible and get it out as quickly as possible. Don't write a large plan, just write the first step. Trust that you'll know better how to proceed after something is released. You're doing it right if you are slightly embarrassed by the minimal feature set shipped in the first iteration. Be open about as many things as possible. By making information public, we can reduce the threshold to contribution and make collaboration easier. Everything at GitLab is public by default. Being direct is about being transparent with each other. We try to be both straightforward and kind. There's a lot more information about what goes into these values, as well as a collection of sub-values that act as substantiators. If you want to know more, please explore our handbook. And remember, as part of our value of transparency, we welcome you to use any of these values to support your own culture building process.
Let's look at a hypothetical startup and how they could go about creating their values. This story represents a common process we see a lot of organizations go through, but it isn't specific to any one company. After this case study, you'll have a chance to discuss your thoughts in the forum. This startup was founded by two friends. They didn't create any value statement at first, but they had a strong culture because the founders were personally connected with every new employee. Within 5 years, the startup was doing really well and experiencing global hypergrowth, but the culture seemed to be struggling to scale and personnel issues were becoming a pervasive problem. So the founders sat down to create a value statement. Their goal was to create values that would uphold the culture of high performance they had from the beginning. They disagreed about what their company values should be, but they were able to come to a compromise without needing input from their team. The founders shared their list of company values with the communications and branding teams, who helped them to write statements supporting what each value meant. Then, the people team was asked to sign off and develop a plan to implement these values. At the next all-hands meeting, the new value statement was shared with the entire company, which now had several hundred employees in many different countries. There were a lot of questions, but there wasn't enough discussion time to get into detail. The founders asked people to send in their feedback in writing. A few teams did send some feedback, mostly the engineering and community teams, but their feedback was mostly contradicting each other. The founders made a few changes to the statement's values, but decided to stick with their gut and keep things mostly as they were originally. A year later, employee turnover was up and satisfaction was low. A common complaint in exit interviews was an unhealthy culture, and several people mentioned the value statement. The founders were surprised because they hadn't heard that feedback. They wanted the values to bring people together, not make them unhappy. This is a fairly common experience. These hypothetical leaders made some mistakes along the way, but their intentions were good. They wanted to enhance and strengthen their company culture. Please use the discussion forum to share some things that might have helped make this process more effective or less effective. In the lessons ahead, we'll talk about why this is so challenging and how to do it a little bit better.
Even if you're a small team or a solo founder, there are resources available to help you build a value statement. But if you have a larger team at your disposal, use them. The greatest resource for determining your values are the people who make up your organization. Take this time to survey your team on your culture and your values. Find out what's working and where you can improve, especially as you move into a distributed, asynchronous environment. Once you've collected information from your team, work with your leadership, your board, and your people team to start selecting values. Start at the top of the organizational chart. The people leading your company should be where this discussion begins and where it ends. They have initial input and they have the final decision-making power on values. But while leadership has the best view of the horizon, they don't always see the view from the ground up. HR professionals should be able to advise on how values will be perceived and how they might be turned into behaviors. Because your values should support your business strategy, also include your advisory board, both as resources for inspiration and as reviewers. The board can also offer an external perspective of how your values will read in your industry. It's not uncommon for organizations to have a leadership retreat to align on the values and behaviors that will become the business's norms going forward. This can be a good opportunity to connect and to share a positive vision of your remote team's future. Apply design thinking techniques that empower attendees to innovate and come up with creative ways to develop values. But also feel free to borrow liberally from other organizations' values. GitLab's values are open source, as are many of the other companies we've mentioned. Don't try to get everyone to agree on the ideal values. This will be an iterative process. Consensus can be too rigid. Instead, understand that the values you're creating will be the starting point and that they will evolve as you implement them. Identify proactive and reactive tactics your leadership will use to roll out the new values. Proactively, you'll want to communicate your expectations, introduce changes carefully, and implement training and reinforcement plans. But you should also plan to react to feedback. If you're creating an open and supportive environment, your team should give you honest feedback on how your values are working for them. This in itself is a powerful way to build culture. And if you react by collecting feedback in good faith and acting on it, you'll strengthen both your values and your team cohesion. Your HR or people team should be given time to prepare some programs and events. Offer both synchronous and asynchronous experiences so people are empowered to ask questions and to do further learning on their own time. AMA or Q&A sessions are a good opportunity for leadership to transparently explain the vision they want to achieve, and these events can go a long way toward building support. For people who want to understand more about how values work, also offer additional training and resources. Finally, consider connecting feedback to values. Encourage people to offer both positive and negative feedback in terms of the organizational values that are most relevant. For example, at GitLab, someone might be praised for supporting the values of collaboration and results by working cross-functionally to complete an important project. Of course, you should document everything thoroughly, from the vision behind the values to how team members can support them. And of course, you should always be willing to iterate on that documentation as feedback comes in.
What happens when a mature organization comes to a point where one of your company values is no longer serving your team as well as it could? Well, I can tell you what we did here at GitLab in 2020 and what we did with the process to evolve and iterate. Our job as leaders is to create an environment where everyone can do the best work of their careers, regardless of their race, their gender identity, their age, religion, ethnicity, ability, sexual orientation, and the list goes on. In the spring of 2019, we sent out a company-wide diversity and inclusion survey. The responses showed that we were doing a good job of inclusion, but the diversity of representation in our staff wasn't where we wanted it to be. Making people feel that they belong without changing anything about themselves. This also matched with some of the chatter we overheard in conversations in Slack channels. As the Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Manager, I met with our CEO to discuss what change could look like and why it would be a positive change. My recommendation was to update the value of diversity and inclusion and to add in belonging. The idea of not belonging wasn't necessarily on leadership's radar because due to their roles, they don't always have an opportunity to hear about what it's like to not fit in. But when they saw the raw data, they could clearly see the need and the value of improving employee happiness and retention. We discussed it in depth, and in the end, we decided to make the change. We created a communication plan and encouraged the team to share their thoughts openly. Some good discussions about what belonging meant came out of that, and it helped people to have a new lens that they could use to evaluate projects and initiatives. The values you envision at the beginning of the process may change as you work to put them in place, or may need to be updated later. You won't always know until you know how to find out what is resonating with your team. But in the remote environment, it's difficult to overhear the chatter. There is no water cooler, and it's easier for people to have private conversations. So don't trust that you'll just find out if people are unhappy. Be proactive about collecting feedback, both quantitative and qualitative. It's most important that the values are right for the time and that the team they serve. Don't get stuck with a value that is no longer resonating. Allow your company culture to evolve.